This is a production of Cornell University.
Environmental crises, economic challenges, and other major disruptions of recent years have led to the need to understand both theory and practice of crisis management, especially from the human perspective. How can our deep connection with nature be transformative and help us recover from these disasters? In a September 2014 Chat in the Stacks talk at Mann Library, Keith Tidball discusses his new book, co-edited with Cornell Professor of Natural Resources Marianne Krasny, to review a variety of research and policy frameworks that explore how green spaces help us recover from disastrous events and become more resilient communities. Dr. Tidball is Senior Extension Associate in the Department of Natural Resources in the Cornell College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, Program Leader for the Nature and Human Security Program, and Associate Director of Cornell's Civic Ecology Lab.
It is a great pleasure to kick off the series, the Chats in the Stacks, and I'm pleased to be here today with you all. And I'm grateful that you chose to spend a little bit of today, especially given the importance of this day, here. I understand these Chats in the Stacks and the ones that I've attended are not supposed to be, hardcore academic talk, and so I'm going to talk about this book and the origins of it, my path to it, and then we'll get a little bit into the sort of nitty-gritty of what you could expect if you were to purchase it from our friend back there in the corner. Thank you for being here. And I will also mention that it is available electronically on the Springer website. So it is the 13th anniversary of September 11th today. And so we should pause, just momentarily at least, to intentionally remember that as we begin. And as was mentioned, I saw the opportunity to have this date a few months ago, and I was glad to be able to do it because it plays an important role this day in the book that I'm going to talk about, this Greening in the Red Zone. The origins of this book are deeply embedded in those events and the aftermath of 9/11. So I'm going to share with you a little personal history that will hopefully shed some light on what this book is. On the 10th of September of 2001, I had undergone a third eye surgery on my right eye in a last attempt to save my eye from blindness that was due to an injury that I received while I was a young lieutenant in the infantry in the mid-90s. And the injury had sidelined me from my duties as a mechanized infantry platoon leader. But during my time in the inactive ready reserve and between the many treatments and surgeries and the recovery time, I was able to complete my master's degree, as was mentioned, and was working at that time as an international affairs officer in the Foreign Service on agriculture and natural resources issues in post-conflict and post-disaster. So I was in my Capitol Hill home, southeast, right off Pennsylvania Avenue, recovering from this surgery on the morning of 9/11. And I received word early in the morning that day that the procedure had not gone well, which was disappointing. And then I watched in horror, as probably many of you did, as the world basically changed before our eyes. And even then, in my sort of painkiller-induced stupor, I anticipated that this would be important to my own fate as well. And it would mean that I would probably be unable to serve with my men, with my guys, to answer the call and to contribute to repelling an attack that no one even understood at that time. And so, for a few years, probably still, I have dealt with a bit of survivor's guilt, if you will, because so many of my fellow men and women did answer that call and came back missing limbs or deeply troubled people or perhaps didn't come home at all. And so 9/11 has become a terrible day for me personally, as well as a day to remember a national tragedy. But turning forward, which what Greening in the Red Zone is about, I was motivated, I would say, to leave the Washington, D.C. area. In 2002, I did. I was invited to come work at Cornell based on some wonderful contacts I had made in the Foreign Service. And through my work in applied research and extension at Cornell, starting back in 2002, as I said, I began to see that people were working through things like PTSD or survivor's guilt or all different kinds of grief and trauma associated with damaging circumstances. And they were doing that through their activities interacting with nature or the environment. Things like community gardening and community forestry, habitat restoration, a la sort of a modern-day version of the Civilian Conservation Corps, and therapeutic outdoor recreation activities. And simultaneously, as I was sort of noticing that just through this broad or generic lens of natural resources, Professor Krasny, my co-editor, secured a grant from the National Science Foundation to conduct a 5-year national study of greening in basically human-dominated or peopled landscapes, predominantly urban landscapes. The idea there was to study those kind of greening activities in green spaces in terms of environmental education. But I was quickly piqued or interested in some of the other dimensions of that as well. Thankfully, she hired me as the national program leader for that effort at that time. That was in 2003, and I've been in the Department of Natural Resources ever since. And it's there, in that initial NSF-funded work, that the ideas for greening in the red zone really began to emerge, and also a pathway for me personally to deal with that story I just told you about 9/11. And how many in the room remember very clearly where they were, what they were doing on 9/11? Most everyone. So that was sort of a galvanizing couple of events, and I think those galvanizing events are important when we're talking about the birth of a book. And this book is sizable, as we'll see in just a minute in terms of the task that was before us in order to get it together. And within the NSF work, I began to also notice, because I was traveling a lot to New York City right after 9/11 and other urban areas, I began to notice specifically the importance of natural elements, symbols of nature, not only for the healing of individuals and neighborhoods, but also sort of as catalytic for healing activities for larger social ecological systems. And people's activities really mattered. They weren't nice-to-dos. They were important. They were fundamental. But they weren't getting much attention from policymakers. Those kinds of social ecological restoration activities after disturbances like 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina began to really intrigue me. This image here is a view from St. Paul's Chapel, which is right there at Ground Zero, to Ground Zero. The empty space here with the fire ladder and the flag is where the towers used to be. And there's an interesting story. These trees buffered St. Paul's Chapel from the blast and the ensuing collapse of the buildings in such a way that St. Paul's Chapel stood throughout that. It's old. George Washington prayed in that chapel. And it became a place of respite and of headquarters for all the first responders for months and maybe even years afterwards. And the trees have become a very, very important component of people's understanding of that sacred space. To that point, this is a bronze cast of this fallen tree. One interesting anecdote, a person told me that particular tree got the Medal of Honor for trees because it gave itself for that chapel. And so this artist basically he used a sandblaster with water, and took all the dirt and sand off the root structure and made a cast of the roots, and now that sits at the Ground Zero. And I found these kinds of symbols everywhere, it turns out. And they're not particularly well understood, but they are these sort of natural symbols portraying the importance of our relationship to nature, especially in times of crisis. So that's that kind of thing started to really pique my interest. Then came Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and began to further refine my thinking and some hypotheses there around greening in red zones. And that thought process eventually led to my own PhD work and later dissertation, which you can find somewhere in this building if you care to read it. And as I progressed through that PhD, documenting other examples of greening in the red zone as part of an expanded literature review became increasingly important. What I didn't realize was happening was the compilation of cases was outgrowing the dissertation itself. It started to grow into its own entity, which I am now glad for. So the book, Greening in the Red Zone, came to be at last as a result of a conference, the 2008 Resilience Conference in Stockholm. I was giving a talk about some of the preliminary work that I had been doing and was approached by an editor from Springer after my talk regarding, hey, what about a book about this? Was a good talk. And sort of the rest is history, except for at that time, I realized that I needed to do probably an edited volume because the stuff that I had was just one case or maybe two cases, and I was much more interested in trying to draw some comparison across many, many cases and tease this apart from multiple disciplines and multiple perspectives. So that determination was made, and that sort of edited volume approach would go much further in terms of both a review of a pretty divergent literature on the role and value of nature and nature interaction in crises, and that the sort of multitude of disciplines represented in this book and perspectives that could be presented in that format would be worthwhile endeavor in terms of a scientific contribution. So I took advantage of Professor Krasny's offer to assist in the project. She's interested in these ideas as well. And we began this long journey of publishing this edited volume. There are 45 authors represented in this edited volume, spread out over 35 chapters plus preface and end material. So, as I said earlier, that was a very, very good example of the phrase herding cats. I don't recommend that approach to that many authors for an edited volume. So that's the journey. That's the story of how the book actually came into existence. And I am often interested in how any sort of book, these artifacts of higher learning, if you will, come to be, how they're born. And that's the story of this one. Now I'll transition into, so what's this thing about anyway? Where's the there? And the question really is, what does this sort of verdant green sort of space that we're familiar with, thankfully, because of where our university is, but many people don't see as much of, what does that have to do with this? Or any of the images that are associated with either conflict or war or natural disaster. And surprisingly, for many people, it has a lot to do with it. So the question that we're really focused in on in this book across many, many disciplines, from the social sciences, forestry, urban forestry, ecology, and many others, is the why question is, why do humans turn to nature and restoring nature in the wake of conflict and disaster? There are a multitude of possible hypotheses and answers provided in this book from many different perspectives. And then sort of the so what question, or the application question, is in the book, what use might this greening in human vulnerability and security contexts be when we're thinking about management, when we're thinking about decision making and policy making? And so again, the diverse perspectives and stories from so many different places provides policymakers and whatnot an opportunity to think through that what use question. And these questions now that this book is complete, are basically my work, my research and extension work, still organized basically around these fundamental questions. And it also must be said that these human vulnerability and security sort of contexts or concerns aren't going away. We hear all the time about population growth, and we hear lots about climate change and vulnerability, and we hear quite a bit about resource scarcity. Those are the recipes for what have been termed red zones in this context. And this is small, and I apologize for it, but this is the State Fragility Index in 2011, and there's plenty of red zones, if you will, and if you go forward in time, those don't seem to be getting smaller. They seem to be actually expanding. Similarly, in terms of disaster severity, intensity, and frequency, again, very small, and I apologize, but the curve is pretty obvious to anybody that's ever spent any time looking at curves. This is 2008, and this is, mid-1900s. So both on the sort of conflict side and on the natural disaster side, red zones aren't going away, and that's pretty clear. So from the book's sort of theoretical perspective, the greening in the red zone idea is that the creation, building these spaces, and then access to these spaces confers resilience. It helps individuals and neighborhoods and whole systems be more resilient and helps in recovery of these systems that are disrupted by violent conflict or disaster. That's the main premise. And the book also, we feel, provides a lot of evidence from all different disciplines for that kind of an assertion through both cases and examples, as well as significant literature reviews across those various chapters. And as I mentioned, there's a variety of research and policy frameworks that are represented in those 35 chapters to explore how creation and access to this green space in these kinds of crisis scenarios contributes to resistance, recovery, and resilience of these disrupted kinds of systems. So let's operationalize this a little bit, in case you haven't read this. Anybody read this? Yay. Handful? Good. Red zones are kind of self-explanatory. This is where hostility, dangerous sorts of circumstances exist. The images that you see here are what you would probably expect to see. We talked earlier about the Pentagon. Here's Iraq. Here's the tsunami in Japan. Those are all very clearly red zones. But it's important to point out that they refer to not just spatial characteristics. They refer also to temporal. And the problem there, obviously, is that gets fuzzy. If you think about what day did post-9/11 era end, it's awful hard to draw that on a map or on a timeline. When did post-World War II end? Well, if you talk to economists, they'll say one thing. If you talk to World War II vets, they're going to say a very different thing in terms of that temporality. But still, it's useful to keep in mind the spatial and temporal sort of settings and contexts that can help us define red zones and these sort of characteristics around red zones. So let's then contrast that with what is greening. For our purposes in this book, this means an active sort of approach, an integrated approach to appreciation, to stewardship, to management of those living elements in the system. And we are using this phrase social-ecological system because our sort of epistemology here, Marianne and I share this, is that social and cultural systems are necessarily embedded in ecosystems. They're not separate. They can't possibly be separate. Therefore, there's no need to talk about coupling. They're already embedded. And as a result of that, we have to find new vocabularies to continue to remember and to rediscover 21st century versions of ecological identities that keep that point firmly in front of our minds. Greening also takes place the greening as operationalized here is taking place in urban areas, predominantly peopled landscapes, towns, townships, informal settlements in the developing world, in even battlefields. There's an author, Kenny Helpand, who has written a really interesting and inspiring book called Defiant Gardens. And he basically has chronicled soldiers in combat situations doing all kinds of greening activities, from gardens and trenches, community forestry activities, etc. He's also an author of one of the chapters in this book. The sites do vary from small woodlands, small sacred gardens and sacred forests in some localities, public and private urban parks, community gardens, as I mentioned earlier, street tree and square plantings, urban square plantings, botanical gardens, cemeteries. All of these are referenced in one way or another by people telling their stories about greening in their red zones. And it can also include entire watersheds and forests and even national or international parks. As one example is the birth of the first national park in Afghanistan actually happened during the conflict. That chapter is written by Peter Smallwood. And then also, this is key, greening involves active participation, the way we operationalize it. There's a number of studies, they're very important, and I appreciate them, about the value of just seeing green. Through a hospital window increases healing times, and there's a number of other important studies about just seeing green. But we're talking about more than seeing green, we're talking about doing green. And so the active involvement is the kind of greening definition or operationalization that we're working for, implying this spending time in and working with the rest of the ecosystem. Some examples, I mentioned one with Afghanistan. Other ones that you'll find in the book, restoration of Iraq's wetlands, supported by community-based natural resources sort of programming and NGOs, as well as partnerships with a number of members of the international scientific community from around the world. There's examples from the replanting of the urban forest in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. That's a very, very interesting case, well researched by a forester who has a good grasp on some of the human dimensions of urban forestry as well. The Living Memorials program, which was originally just a small effort by the Forest Service to document these memorials that were springing up, sort of spontaneous memorials after 9/11. Congress recognized the importance of that, and I think it's a historically important moment when Congress directed USDA's Forest Service to come up with the program to keep track of all those, and they have been documented since 2001. And it's very interesting to look at that data in terms of the pulses of when those memorials. Nowadays, those memorials appear and are active basically today, every year. And there's little valleys and peaks at other times throughout the year. Other examples, I just mentioned Bandi Amir National Park right during the middle of the conflict in Afghanistan. Beautiful place, beautiful pictures of it. There are quite a few images in the book too if you're interested in pictures. Lots of them. And then another one that's important, and I'm actually going to continue doing some work on this one, especially the Korean version now with Isaac, who's here today. Conservation efforts in demilitarized borderlands in the Korean Peninsula and between Greece and Cyprus, and this whole notion of what the sort of liminal spaces, these betwixt and between spaces actually mean to social ecological system resilience, what opportunities exist there for peace, peace building, peacemaking, environmental peacemaking, and also some of the challenges politically and socially when those spaces are basically arbitrarily put on a map. But even despite that arbitrariness of those spaces on the map, they still end up being repositories or even refuges for many, many species because they're off limits to a lot of human activity. There are a number of other avenues if you're interested in chasing this down from the sort of academic standpoint. There are some other books that do a nice job of synthesizing some of this, including this book, Environmental Peacemaking by Ken Konka and Jeffrey DeBelco, both very active with the Woodrow Wilson Center on Environmental Security. And I mentioned Defiant Gardens, that's Kenny Helphand's book, that is a wonderful collection of stories. And then this pretty recently published book, Assessing and Restoring Natural Resources in Post-Conflict Peace Building. So there's growing interest in the value of our relationship in nature and our relationships in nature as they result in or relate to the resilience or lack thereof of social ecological system. On top of that, there are numerous now scientific journal articles that are beginning to pull and push at some of these ideas, if you're interested in this from a purely academic standpoint. I want to briefly touch on both the types of red zones and the sort of locations. I'm not going to read this entire list for you, but you can scan through here and see that we're pretty diverse in terms of locations around the globe, as well as the kinds of red zones, from the ongoing wars in the Middle East to post-Soviet Cold War urban insecurity, the DMZ, as we mentioned, World War II bombings in Japan. I mean, we tried to be very diverse in terms of what we were presenting to make this as thorough as we could. Clearly, though, we're just scratching the surface, and we acknowledge that. And again, we haven't figured out exactly what we're going to do with the sort of murkiness around especially the temporal boundaries for what is a red zone. I will also point out, Chuck is here, Chuck Geisler, there's a couple of chapters in here that aren't specifically case studies of greening in the red zone, but I would call them more an analysis of what it actually means to be thinking in these terms for a particular locale, and more broadly in terms of larger sort of social questions and sort of geopolitical context. And I would, if you don't get a chance to read the whole book, please read Chuck's chapter, which is these chapters are all available as PDFs individually, by the way, on the Springer website too. So there are a handful of those that are more circumspect, kind of pieces as opposed to case study pieces that you may be interested in. The upshot, the sort of so what, why should we do it? Why should we engage in greening in the red zone is the question I'm often asked when I present this in the sort of policy circles, in post-conflict audiences, let's say at USAID, Agency for International Development, or at UN meetings or others. And I think these are the things that sort of rise to the top after working with these chapters for a while, writing 3 or 4 of them myself and trying to synthesize in introduction and conclusions. The greening in the red zone approach does a few of these things, contributing shared sense of identity or rebuilding identity or place meanings and those kinds of things seems important. Improve psychological, cognitive, and social health aspects seems to come across in many of the chapters, not surprisingly. The activity themselves fostering deeper senses of self-worth as not only individuals but as communities, I think, is also important. And this notion that that greening in red zones restarts ecosystem services or catalyzes them is a very important one that needs further discussion. In fact, I'm working with my colleagues at the Stockholm Resilience Center right now to see how we can measure and analyze the capturing of this energy around greening in red zones initially, so that critical ecosystem services and functions can be restarted in red zone sort of scenarios. And then obviously, because greeners often form partnerships or they create their NGOs on their own, this contributes to these ideas that are mentioned in those other books about the benefits of polycentric governance approaches rather than very command and control, top-down approaches that we often see being deployed after a conflict or after a major natural disaster. What we found, what seems to rise through here is that when those top-down command and control approaches are put in place, it squelches opportunities for people to express all these other things in this list that can be a result of these kinds of things like greening in red zones. At the systems level, there's a whole literature on systems thinking, ecosystems thinking. What's important here from the systems perspective, if that's your cup of tea, is that within the context of the resilience literature as it's written about in academia, not as it's used as a buzzword, this greening concept operates back across these boundaries and spatial skills that we talked about earlier. And that's an important function of greening in red zones that merits further study. Also, I think it's important to focus on these various case studies, bringing to the fore the idea that deficit-based approaches are not necessarily helpful to the communities on the ground. What's missing, what's wrong is obviously problematic, and everybody's trying to cope with that. But what are the assets? In asset-based approaches, the idea of life and planting green things and living and growing are all about hope and optimism, and they're about assets rather than focusing on the destruction and even in the most dystopic or dystopic, however you pronounce that, sort of environments. This hope and optimism that you see flourishing when people are involved in greening activities, I think, is one of the main things that bubbles up from many of these chapters. And small cases of that point to larger implications. What we see right now, if you pay attention to the CIA's annual report about what they worry about, they continue to talk about natural resource scarcity, water, and other sorts of environmental concerns. And this is more and more a part of those annual reports. Well, we have some small cases that may point to larger implications that they probably need to be thinking about, they and others that are in the security environment. And we're starting to see that these ideas are being at least asked about in those contexts. I doubt very seriously, I will worry, in fact, very much if the CIA comes to ask me too many questions about greening in the red zone. And again, just because this is Cornell University, In terms of environmental research in disaster and war, why would this be important? Because I think it points to this fundamental problem that I think is there, that we need more explicit examples of how critically important our interdependence with the rest of nature is. And what we find is that when it gets really tough, suddenly people remember how important their relationship with the environment is. And I think that as part of my larger body of work, and I'll talk about this briefly in my last slide, anywhere where you can see crystal clear examples of people's realization or remembrance of their dependence on the rest of the ecosystem needs to be paid attention to, especially as we think about climate change and mitigation and all the rest. Also, I think this power of acknowledging this innate biophilia, or our desire to, and I know biophilia in the E.O. Wilson sort of way is problematic, but I'm thinking a little more broadly about this sort of urgent biophilia concept, and that we urgently want to reaffiliate with other living elements when we're threatened. I think that acknowledging that one, and we see that time and time again in examples in here, is also powerful and not particularly well leveraged in terms of conflict and destruction, but could be, and somebody with an eye towards that, reading these cases and perhaps pursuing other cases, could benefit. So that's why, and another reason I think this is important to environmental research in the disaster and war context. I mentioned earlier ecological identity. I think the importance of remembering and reconstituting a 21st century version of our ecological identity, trying to find some sort of balance, is also an important ramification of this work. And finally, this recurring optimism that happens among these greeners to try to mitigate structural violence and replace that with sort of peaceful, sustainable coexistence is quite important. And when the structural violence looks political, geopolitical, looks like security, looks like nation states, there's a lot we can learn from greening in the red zone. If you extrapolate that to structural violence to our fellow living creatures, whatever they are, then that structural violence and these approaches starts to get real interesting from the sort of environmental philosophy standpoint or environmental psychology standpoint. So I think there are some important lessons and important questions rising there too in terms of mitigating structural violence. Where to now? From the standpoint of the Civic Ecology Lab in the Department of Natural Resources, this notion of portals, I'm focused on this greening in the red zone and other portals, if you will, or windows where people can see their loss of ecological identity and pathways to recovering ecological identity. And I think that individual and societal levels of reconstituting and re-understanding and maybe reinventing our relationships with the rest of the ecosystem is important. So this is a first step in that for my own work. I will point to this book that will be coming out hopefully before Christmas called Civic Ecology. It'll be published by MIT Press, myself and Marianne. Again, teamed up for that one. That will be a not case studies, that will be an authored, somewhat theoretical, but written in lay terms about some of these ideas. For really getting to sort of more substantive questions. I'm also working a lot based on what we found here and based on all, these 45 smart people working on thinking this through. One of the places that this has the most application right now is with the thousands and thousands of veterans coming back, not only in the United States, but many other countries have been involved in the longest war in modern times, how their outdoor recreation and other sort of greening activities can be a part of their reconciliation, recovery, and resilience is an important thing that I'm involved in now. I have grant funding from USDA and from the Department of Defense to look at that, and that's an important sort of next step that is a result of greening in the red zone. And finally, the Civic Ecology Lab, we're working to attract graduate students and others to think about policy education and outreach regarding this greening in the red zone approach for policymakers and first responders in the international disaster context to try to understand what does extension in the 21st century look like in these contexts, especially given some of the threatening language we hear about climate change and more conflict. So I want to acknowledge before I stop and let us have a chance to chat, because it is Chats in the Stacks, these are some important people that have been involved in this project, as well as were also involved in my PhD. Mark Bain, who's unfortunately no longer with us. Thomas Elmquist there from the Stockholm Resilience Center, Marianne Krasny, Max Pfeffer, Rich Stedman, my wife Mo. Important to point out Springer and Margaret Deignan, who was the person that approached me and then helped this project come to fruition over a period of years. Also some community partners that crystallized a lot of these ideas. Parkway Partners in New Orleans, Hike for Katrina, the Community Forestry and Environmental Research Partnerships Group, and funding, again, for a lot of this work coming from USDA, the Forest Service, and NSF. So with that, I will thank you all for your attention. Again, thank you for sharing a part of this important day. If you're interested in this mural is very, very moving and powerful. It's in New York City in Manhattan, not far from Ground Zero. And I can share with you where that address is if you're interested in seeing it. It's big. Those flower towers are impressive. The address for Springer's link to this book is here. It's a long URL. I apologize for that. I can get that for you if you're interested in it after this. So, thank you.
This has been a production of Cornell University. On the web at cornell.edu.